He knew exactly what day he would die, but Timothy L. Coleman didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't even flinch. What he did instead was terrifying in its calmness. His final request wasn't for forgiveness, it was for barbecue ribs. And as the poison coursed through his veins on October 30th, 2025, his last words echoed not with remorse, but with a cold defiance that left even the prison guards shaken. Who was Timothy Coleman? Why did he murder a man who had once trusted him with his life? And what does a crime committed nearly 3 decades ago still reveal about justice in America today? This is the haunting true story of a man who killed a snitch and showed no mercy even at the end. To understand the man strapped to a gurney nearly 30 years later, you have to go back to where it all started. Dayton, Ohio, mid-1990s. A city caught in the grip of a slow collapse. Jobs were drying up. Factories were closing. And entire neighborhoods were left behind to rot in silence. Drugs filled the void. So did fear. Timothy Lee Coleman grew up in that silence. Born in 1971, Coleman was a product of systemic neglect. His childhood records were thin, but what little existed painted a portrait of instability. Multiple foster homes, school absences, encounters with juvenile services that never led to lasting support. People who knew him back then described him as soft-spoken but wary. Someone who never smiled unless he had to. Someone who had learned early that trust was a weakness. By the time he was in his 20s, Coleman had become part of the invisible undercurrent of street life. He wasn't a gang member, he wasn't a killer, not yet. But he was deeply entrenched in the low-level drug trade. Moving small quantities, making connections, keeping quiet. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention, and he liked it that way. Ronald Young was the opposite, a former acquaintance. Some say a friend. Others say just a familiar face in a dangerous business. Ronald had made a name for himself as someone who was trying to get out. Someone who had crossed the unspoken line. When he agreed to cooperate with local law enforcement and provide information about drug activities in Montgomery County, it marked him as a threat. The rules of the street were not written down, but everyone knew them. You do not talk, you do not testify, and if you do, you disappear. On the morning of July 19, 1996, Ronald Young was found dead in his Dayton home, shot at close range. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, just silence and death. Investigators quickly connected dots that pointed to one man, Timothy L. Coleman. The motive, they argued, was retaliation. A message not just to Young, but to anyone else thinking about helping the police. Coleman was arrested less than a week later. He maintained his innocence at first. Said nothing, no confession, no emotion. But prosecutors built a case. Witnesses emerged. One claimed Coleman had talked about silencing Young. For good. Ballistics matched. The pieces fell into place. At trial, Coleman remained stone-faced. He never took the stand, never begged for mercy. In 1997, he was sentenced to death. But behind the headlines and court documents was a deeper story. One about poverty, about betrayal, about a justice system where survival and silence often go hand in hand. Timothy Coleman became inmate number A337226 on Ohio's death row. For years, he barely spoke to the media, rarely filed appeals. It was as if he had accepted that this was how the story would end. But when the date of execution was finally set for October 30th, 2025, after nearly 3 decades in solitary confinement, the world would once again be forced to look at the man who had once pulled a trigger in the name of silence, and ask if anything had changed. The year was 1996. The place was West Dayton, Ohio, a part of the city that rarely made the news unless someone had been shot. This wasn't the postcard version of America. This was the forgotten corridor of crumbling brick houses, flickering streetlights, and long-abandoned storefronts. Crack cocaine had torn through the neighborhoods like a slow-moving fire, leaving behind ashes in human form. Unemployment was high, hope was low, and trust was almost non-existent. In this corner of Dayton, Timothy Coleman was just another face blending into the noise. No one feared him. but no one truly knew him either. He walked with a quiet, deliberate pace, eyes down, voice low, the kind of man who watched more than he spoke. Neighbors remember seeing him come and go at odd hours, always alone, always cautious. He didn't throw parties, he didn't cause scenes, but there was something in his presence that said, "Don't ask questions." He rented a small unit in a rundown apartment complex just off Germantown Street, the kind of place where the wallpaper peeled from the corners and rats moved like shadows across the kitchen floor. No one ever visited, no family, no friends, just Coleman and the silence. But silence doesn't last long in places like Dayton. There were rumors that he was connected to local dealers, that he helped transport small packages in exchange for cash. Some said he had a temper, but only when pushed. Others said he had once served as muscle for a bigger name who had since disappeared. Then there was Ronald Young. Ronald wasn't a saint. He had done his share of wrong. But by 1996, he had grown tired. Tired of the raids, tired of the threats, tired of watching his family fall apart. So when the police came knocking, Ronald opened the door, and he talked. That act alone was enough to make him a target. The streets did not forgive betrayal, and Coleman was someone who still believed in codes even if they were written in blood. According to those close to the case, something changed in Coleman during those months. He grew quieter, more distant. He stopped frequenting the usual spots. He seemed distracted, paranoid, always looking over his shoulder. Some say he was planning something. Others say he was already lost. What is certain is that in the weeks leading up to Ronald Young's death, Coleman was seen driving past Young's house more than once, always late at night, always alone. A neighbor recalled seeing him sitting in his car just staring at the front door, engine running, lights off. Another resident remembered Coleman visiting a pawn shop just days before the murder. He left with nothing, but his eyes were restless, hollow, focused on something only he could see. In hindsight, these details feel like red flags, but at the time they were just fragments, moments lost in a city where violence was too common to be surprising. No one expected the quiet man from the corner unit to commit murder, but no one was paying attention. It was just past 10 p.m. on July 18, 1996. The heat in Dayton lingered long after sunset, and the air was heavy with that particular stillness that comes before something breaks. Ronald Young was home alone that night. His wife and children had gone to visit family out of town. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. He had just finished dinner. The TV was on, but no one was really watching. At approximately 10:22 p.m., a neighbor heard what they thought was a car door closing outside. Nothing unusual, not in that part of town. A few minutes later, another neighbor reported hearing a single loud pop, then silence, not a scream, not a struggle, just the sudden drop in sound. Ronald was found the next morning. His brother had come by to check on him after repeated unanswered calls. He used a spare key. The house was still locked. Nothing appeared stolen. No signs of forced entry. The living room was intact. The lights were off. The only thing out of place was Ronald himself. He was lying on the floor just a few feet from the front door. One gunshot wound to the head, close range, execution style. Police arrived within minutes. At first glance, it didn't look like a robbery. There were no signs of ransacking, no valuables missing. But something else stood out. There was no defensive wound, no sign of a fight. Whoever had killed Ronald Young had likely been invited in, or at the very least was familiar enough not to raise alarm. Detectives started asking questions. Ronald's family confirmed he had recently agreed to cooperate with police in a local drug investigation. That information immediately shifted the focus of the investigation. They weren't just looking for a killer, they were looking for a message. Timothy L. Coleman's name surfaced within 48 hours. He was known to associate with some of the same people being investigated, and he had history with Ronald. Quiet tension, mutual suspicion. A witness came forward and claimed that Coleman had spoken bitterly about Ronald just days earlier. Another reported seeing a man matching Coleman's description parked near Ronald's house the night of the murder. Police followed the trail. Surveillance teams watched Coleman for 2 days. They observed him leaving his apartment at odd hours, driving aimlessly. On the 3rd day, he was pulled over and taken in for questioning. He said nothing. Police obtained a warrant to search his apartment. Inside, they found a .38 caliber revolver hidden beneath floorboards in a back closet, the same caliber as the bullet that killed Ronald Young. Ballistic tests would later confirm the match. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, but the gun spoke louder than either. In the interrogation room, Coleman remained still. He refused to answer most questions. He asked for a lawyer. Then he went quiet. The case against him began to form quickly. Prosecutors painted him as a man bound by a brutal street code, someone who viewed cooperation with the police as betrayal, someone who saw Ronald Young not as a man with a family, but as a threat that had to be neutralized. They called it a calculated hit, cold, deliberate, personal. And for the jury that would later decide his fate, those words would be difficult to forget. The autopsy confirmed what the scene had already suggested. Ronald E. Young had been killed instantly. A single bullet entered just above his right ear and exited through the opposite side. There was no hesitation, no struggle, just one clean shot. According to the medical examiner, the trajectory and powder burns indicated close range, less than 2 feet. Whoever pulled the trigger was face to face with him. That detail chilled even the detectives. Ronald had trusted his killer, or at least had not feared him enough to run. Crime scene investigators combed through the house inch by inch. The front door was locked when police arrived. There were no signs of forced entry. That meant either Ronald had let the shooter in voluntarily, or the door was unlocked and the killer walked in without resistance. There were no surveillance cameras, no audio recordings. The murder weapon was missing, at least for now. But sometimes the absence of evidence can be just as telling. Investigators began mapping Ronald's recent contacts, phone records, visits, conversations. And time after time, the same name kept surfacing: Timothy Coleman. Police knew him well enough. Not a major player, but not a ghost either. His criminal record included minor drug offenses and loitering. Nothing violent, nothing that screamed murder. But the context had changed, and now every detail mattered. One piece of information stood out. Ronald Young had testified confidentially to a grand jury in connection with a broader narcotics case. That testimony had been sealed, but detectives believed someone on the street had found out, or been tipped off. Coleman had both the motive and the opportunity. Then came the break. During a sweep of Coleman's apartment, officers found an old Army surplus duffel bag hidden behind a panel in the closet. Inside were several items that raised red flags: disposable gloves, a flashlight, a torn scrap of paper with an address and time scribbled in red ink. The address matched Ronald's street, but the most important item was the handgun, a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver, dusty but still functional. The ballistics team got to work. After test firing and comparing the marks left on the bullet recovered from Ronald's body, the conclusion was clear. It was a match. That gun had fired the fatal shot. There were no fingerprints on the weapon. Coleman had been careful. No direct DNA either. But prosecutors didn't need a confession. They had a timeline, a motive, a witness who placed Coleman near the crime scene. And now they had the gun. Still, Coleman said nothing. He never denied ownership, never claimed the gun was planted. He simply looked at the evidence and stayed silent. Detectives later said his calm was unsettling. Not panicked, not cold, just empty, as if nothing had changed. But for Ronald's family, they had lost a husband, a father, a man who tried to do the right thing, and now they wanted justice. For the prosecution, this was no longer just a murder case. It was about protecting the system, about sending a message that silencing a witness would never go unpunished. And Timothy L. Coleman was about to face that message in a courtroom built on rules he had chosen to ignore. The trial of Timothy L. Coleman began in the summer of 1997 at the Montgomery County Common Pleas Court. The courtroom was quiet, tense, and watched closely by a community still reeling from the murder of a man who had tried to help clean up the streets. From the very beginning, the prosecution laid out their theory with precision. They called it an execution. They called it retaliation. They said it was not a crime of passion but a calculated act of control, meant to silence one man and warn others. Their case centered around the gun found in Coleman's apartment, the ballistics match, the witness who placed him near the scene, the handwritten note with the Ronald's address, and the motive that tied everything together. Coleman, they argued, had followed the unspoken law of the street. Snitches get silenced, and Ronald had broken that law. The jury listened closely. Some took notes, others just stared. The defense took a different route. They never claimed Ronald Young wasn't dead. They didn't even deny that Coleman had known him. But they tried to sow doubt, reasonable doubt. They questioned the reliability of the witness who claimed to see Coleman near the scene. They pointed out that there were no fingerprints on the gun, no confession, no video, no DNA. They hinted at the possibility that the weapon had been planted, that someone else with a grudge against Ronald had used Coleman as a convenient fall guy. That, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, rumors could be dangerous. But the jury wasn't convinced. The prosecution reminded them of Coleman's silence, his lack of reaction, his refusal to explain the presence of the gun, his calm during interrogation. They framed it not as innocence, but as cold calculation. The trial lasted less than 2 weeks. On the 11th day, the jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell into stillness. Guilty? Timothy L. Coleman showed no visible reaction. He stood as the judge read the sentence. Death by lethal injection. One of Ronald's sisters wept silently in the gallery. Another simply nodded. A small, quiet victory in a war they never wanted to be part of. But the story didn't end there. Over the next 2 decades, Coleman would file several appeals. Most were procedural, claims of ineffective counsel, requests for further DNA testing, allegations of unfair jury selection. Each one was reviewed, denied, and dismissed. In 2005, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld the conviction. In 2012, a federal court rejected a final habeas corpus petition. Throughout it all, Coleman remained mostly silent. He did not speak to reporters. He refused interviews. His legal team said he preferred privacy. Some believed he had accepted his fate. Others believed he was still clinging to a personal code that did not allow for confession. In 2024, the Ohio governor denied his final request for clemency. That same month, an execution date was set, October 30th, 2025. Almost 30 years after the murder of Ronald Young, the state of Ohio prepared to carry out the sentence it had imposed, and Timothy L. Coleman prepared to die. As of now, Timothy L. Coleman remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio, awaiting execution. His final date has been scheduled for October 30th, 2025. In the months leading up to that date, Coleman has kept a low profile. Public records show no major disciplinary incidents during his decades of incarceration. He has not granted interviews. He has not released any public statements. And according to court records, he has exhausted all legal appeals. Unlike some inmates who use their final months to speak out or seek clemency, Coleman has chosen silence. It is not known whether he has family members in contact with him or if he intends to make any last-minute appeals for mercy. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction has not released details regarding his preparation for execution, citing standard confidentiality policies. What we do know is that Coleman has been incarcerated since 1996, that he has spent over 28 years in prison, including the vast majority in solitary confinement, that he was sentenced to death for the execution-style murder of a man who had cooperated with police, and unless something changes between now and the end of October, the state of Ohio will carry out that sentence. What he chooses to say or not say in those final hours remains to be seen. As of this recording, the execution of Timothy L. Coleman has not yet taken place. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction has scheduled the lethal injection for October 30th, 2025. According to state procedures, Coleman will be transferred to the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville at least 24 hours before the scheduled execution. There, he will be placed under what is known as Death Watch. During that time, Coleman will be under constant supervision. He will have the opportunity to meet with a spiritual advisor if he requests one. He will also be given the option to choose a final meal within the state's guidelines. Whether he will make a final statement is unknown. Whether any members of the victim's family will witness the execution has not been disclosed. What is certain is that if the sentence proceeds as scheduled, Coleman will be administered a series of drugs designed to sedate, paralyze, and stop his heart. The process typically takes under 15 minutes. Unless a last-minute appeal or executive intervention halts the execution, Timothy L. Coleman will become one of the latest individuals to be executed in the state of Ohio. Timothy L. Coleman's case raises uncomfortable questions that still linger decades after the murder that put him on death row. Ronald Young was a father, a husband, a man who made the difficult decision to cooperate with the police in a community where silence was often seen as survival. For that choice, he paid with his life. The justice system responded with another death sentence, swift by legal standards, but carried out only after nearly 30 years of appeals, delays, and procedural reviews. So now the question echoes quietly beneath the surface. Is this justice fulfilled, or is it justice deferred so long that its meaning begins to blur? Coleman never confessed. He never apologized. His silence has become part of the story, a silence that could be read as defiance, or regret, or something no one outside his mind will ever fully understand. What does it mean when a man spends more time waiting to die than he ever spent free in the world? What does it mean to punish someone for silencing another with silence of our own? And when the drugs finally flow through Coleman's veins, if they do, will the cycle truly end? Or will another name take his place? These are not easy questions, but perhaps they're the ones we should be asking. If you found this story thought-provoking, consider watching our other videos on death row cases, where last meals reveal hidden truths and final words echo louder than any sentence.